cool. Real. It's real.
What is crackin', everybody? Hello and welcome back to Gaming 101 with Mr. Berger. Tonight we'll be taking a look at this Goblin Giant Double Prince deck. Now this is a really interesting deck, and it's actually one that was played before with the role of the Goblin Giant being taken by the regular Giant. Now the Goblin Giant is a really interesting card. Let's talk about that for a minute before we jump into the rest of this deck here. It has the unique mechanic of having the two Spear Goblins essentially invulnerable as long as the Giant himself is alive. So it doesn't work quite like a regular Giant because you have those two Spear Goblins as well. On top of that, of course, they jump out when the Giant dies, providing you with those extra two Spear Goblins to soak up extra hits or provide a little bit of extra damage. And you know, a lot of people were like, oh, it's just like a Rascals or whatever, but it's not. It has a pretty cool unique mechanic that we haven't seen exactly before. We've seen a few things that are kind of similar, but you know, nothing quite like this. So it's pretty interesting. It doesn't do a whole lot of damage to the extra damage to the Princess Tower, but it does provide a little bit of extra chip damage, and on top of that it clears out things that are taking out your Giant. So I'll talk about this more in depth later, but for example, if they put that bats down to counter your Giant, now you got those Spear Goblins on the back of the Goblin Giant, and they will completely clear out those bats within a matter of seconds, providing leeway, safe passage for the Giant himself to go onto the enemy Princess Tower. Alright, well that's enough about that. Let's go ahead and jump into where I found this deck and then the strategies about it, and I'll talk more in depth about the Goblin Giant himself in a little bit. Alright, so I actually found this deck on Deck Shop. Now if you guys don't know this site, one of my very first videos I did like an online gaming resources video, and Deck Shop was like the hot website at the time. And it's still really good, I still really like it, but it's just that now you have Royale API, and you have Stats Royale, and things like that. Look at that Goblin Giant there, kiting that P.E.K.K.A like a boss, and chipping away at him the whole time, or her, excuse me, the whole time with those Spear Goblins. So I actually found this deck on Deck Shop. It's deckshop.pro if you want to go to your web browser and check it out. And it was the only deck available as of, I think it was this morning, maybe it was yesterday that I got it, with the Goblin Giant in it. Now they actually added a new one when I checked earlier tonight, but either way, this was the one, and I was like, okay, cool, this is basically the exact same Giant Double Prince deck that was popular for a while. There was like a bait one, like a Zap Bait Giant Double Prince deck for a while. I think that's what it was, and then there was this other 3-spell variation. And this is the same as that deck, but rather than the Giant, you have now the Goblin Giant in there. Alright, so it's been a while since I found a deck on deckshop.pro, but I thought, hey, this looks really solid, and it's legitimate. Like, I've been seeing a number of Double Prince decks lately since the Prince got that, you know, pretty minor buff. I guess actually 5% HP is pretty significant, honestly, for in this game. That's like a pretty considerable amount. So yeah, he got that buff, and that's making him more, you know, powerful, and in that light, he becomes more popular. So that kind of revamped the presence of the Giant Double Prince. Alright, so let's see. As I mentioned, I've seen a resurgence of this deck, this Giant Double Prince deck, but it's not as strong as it used to be, because both the Prince and the Dark Prince got nerfed multiple times. You know, they got their charge time increased when they, you know, synchronized all the charge time and jump times of all the units in the game, like the Mega Knight and the Bandit and all that good stuff, right? Or wait, is Bandit still different? Anyway, you get the point. So it's not as strong as it used to be, but it's still pretty consistent and it's still pretty decent. And if you're using it to get the challenge done, the Goblin Giant challenge, this is definitely a pretty solid deck. Alright, let's talk a little bit about the Goblin Giant himself again. And since I mentioned most of his cool aspects earlier, I can just kind of skim through this and make sure that I cover those major bullet points essentially that I wanted to be sure to include about this guy, this big green dude. Now this guy is great for kiting. If you have him in a deck with like an Ice Golem and a Battle Ram, oh man. Oh dude, that would be so awesome. I gotta do that. I gotta try that out. Do this Goblin Giant with a Battle Ram and an Ice Golem and some support in the deck, some spells, it'll work out great. Because, like I mentioned earlier, when he's running, when you place him in the opposite lane and like the Giant Skeleton or the P.E.K.K.A or whatever is chasing him, those Spear Goblins are consistently chipping away at whatever is chasing him. And on top of that, when he pushes into the enemy lane, you know, those spear goblins, look, now they're not doing too much in that particular situation, but they were providing some chip damage to that baby dragon, and, you know, potentially taking out the goblin gang too. If it was just a goblin gang, they would have probably eventually taken it out before the giant himself died. Now, lastly, on top of all of that, once he does die, they pop out. So that is 2 P.E.K.K.A swings, or 2 Prince swings, or 2 mini P.E.K.K.A swings. Or that is, you know, 1 extra swing from whatever, or that's a little bit of extra chip damage, and, you know, that can make all the difference in the world when it comes to this particular game. You know, that little bit, like, sometimes the enemy's tower literally has 1 health left, so that little bit of extra chip damage could have come in clutch if you had gotten it, had you not had, or since you have the spear goblins, I'm losing my train of thought here, but since you have the spear goblins, you know, you would get that extra chip damage once they die, versus with the regular giant, you know, once he dies, then there's no spear goblins to provide that extra chip damage. Alright guys, next thing that I want to note about this deck, this is a triple spell deck. So sometimes that can end you up with an awkward hand, but I've found in this particular deck there's pretty much always something to play. And that's because you can pretty much open with any of these troop cards. The cards that are in this deck, the troop cards that we have in this deck, are all pretty safe and reliable to be able to use as an opener. So even though you might end up with log, poison, and zap in your hand, your 4th card is always going to be a troop. So even though it's a 3 spell deck, it's, you know, something that you don't have to worry too much about. You don't have too much anti-air. You do have the poison and zap if you have those spells. And I actually no, because the giant now has a spear goblin, so that gives you a little bit more anti-air. And then of course you have the mega minion, and you have the Ewis. Now, another thing, since this is a triple spell deck, you know, since I finished talking about that thing about what was it? You know, not getting an awkward hand. Sometimes you can actually just use those spells to clear out your hand a little bit aggressively, or even to finish off a tower. And you'll see that in a lot of these replays that I show here. In fact, I think in the very first one that I showed, I was able to chip away at the enemy's tower with all 3 of my spells at the very end there to finish it off before he wrecked my tower with a giant snowball wave coming there. And having the poison and the log in there, you can successfully take out a witch and all kinds of, you know, support units. It's really cool. It's really fun to have those 3 spells in there. And keep in mind, that's a lot of extra spell damage, so you can chip away or finish off an opponent's tower if it has a significant amount of health left by just, you know, throwing poisons on it and trying to get value whenever you get the chance, making sure that you zap, you know, when the minions are passing by the tower, or log when he sends in a goblin gang and get the tower too, right? So try to take advantage of those 3 spells, and keep in mind that you can use them to finish off a tower. Now, the deck itself, it can be played defensively. We have a lot of defensive cards in there. You got the Ewiz, you got the Prince, you got the Dark Prince, you got the Mega Minion. Even the Goblin Giant can be played defensively because, as I mentioned, you can use him to kite. You can use him to, you know, soak up damage. So all kinds of stuff. And then, of course, you can always use your spells defensively, and you don't get the tower damage off in that particular scenario. But if it's like, you know, skeleton army coming down, you've got something to answer it. You know, you've got a zap and you've got a log. So if they're playing like a bait deck, which isn't too popular right now, you've got 2 answers to all their bait units. You know, like if you zap their goblin gang, now you have log for their goblin barrel or their princess or whatever, right? So you got the 3 spells in there, and you can use those things defensively, just like a lot of these cards. Troop cards is what I meant to say. And these troop cards, once they've played their defensive role, unlike a spell, they can go ahead and go on to a really successful offense. And since you've got this kind of aggressive counter-push style of a deck, that offensive push can be really deadly. Because you've got those 2 princes in there, they're both charge units, so you use them defensively, maybe you don't even, you know, gain benefit of their charge on defense because you just need to use them for the role of, you know, like killing that witch or killing that wizard or whatever. Then all of a sudden, your opponent has a prince charging down his lane or her lane, and if it connects to the tower, it does an insane amount of damage. And look at this right here. I played safely and defensively the whole game, and at the end there, I was able to build up a massive push with the 2 princes, you know, the Mega Minion, the Goblin Giant, and then at this point, I can pretty much just spell cycle if I want to, but I want to play it safely. I want to make sure that I don't fall into the trap of wasting too much elixir on cycling spells and then allowing him to build up a massive push and counter me. So I actually use the Goblin Giant a little bit aggressively because I want to try to get one swing on the tower off, and I don't quite get it, but it looks like the poison, and then my other spells are going to be able to finish it. So we'll see how it goes for the rest of the game here. So that being said, play defense, play a hard defense, and then go for that aggressive counter push. Once you get into double elixir time, yeah, there's the spells finishing off the tower. Once you get into double elixir time, you can definitely be more aggressive because you've got the giant and you've got the two princes, and those can definitely be played kind of like a bridge spam style deck at the bridge. Now, lastly, on top of that, the Ewiz and the Mega Minion are great defensive cards that provide a pretty deadly counter push. I mean, Ewiz has just been a really powerful card since he was released. He has a unique utility with his Enter the Arena effect, his stun when he enters the arena, his consistent stun with his auto attack, the fact that he can attack 2 units at the same time, all kinds of cool stuff. Retargets, causes enemy towers to retarget onto your miner, and if you have a miner in your deck, or in this case, a Goblin Giant maybe, all kinds of cool stuff. So he runs quickly too, so he kind of fits really well into this deck. Alright, let's talk about opening moves, card replacements, and then we will call it a video. So for opening moves, pretty much cycle in the back. As I mentioned before, you could potentially get to a point where you got 3 spells in hand, and you don't have any troops to play. Actually, that's not the case, because in this deck, you'll always have something that you can play, and it's pretty much safe to cycle any of those 5 remaining troops in the back. Because you've got 3 spells, you're always going to have a 4th card. It's always going to be Prince, Dark Prince, Goblin Giant, Ewiz, or Mega Minion. So whichever one you have, you can cycle in the back. That's my personal preference for opening moves, because I like to get the game going. But if you're one of those people who likes to hang tight and burn time until you get to double elixir time, this might be a good deck for that. Or maybe you want to play defense, just wait to see what they do, let them make the first move and counter accordingly. Be my guest. Play like that. That's totally fine. You can also, use your spells to counter whatever they may have put down as your opening move, if that is your particular taste and strategy, using a spell as an opener. But that's more like situational, right? If they send in a hog, or not a hog aggressively, but like a goblin barrel aggressively, then you can open with your log to counter. Alrighty. Cheaper cards, of course, would be your priority, because you don't want to invest too much elixir in your opening move, because you want to be able to counter, and that's the whole idea behind not being the person to make the first move, in waiting until your opponent plays in to counter, depending on what they play. Because you don't want to have like a situation where, okay, you use the 6th elixir Goblin Giant in the back, and then all of a sudden they've got like, a Balloon Rage or something like that in the opposite lane, and then all of a sudden you have nothing to counter because all you have is your Prince and your spells or something like that. So I'm just, spitballing that off the top of my head, but anyway, you get the idea. So it's safer to open with a cheaper card. So if you have the decision between like your Mega Minion and your Prince or your Goblin Giant, go with probably the Mega Minion. Mega Minion is pretty slow anyway, so he's a pretty safe opener, because he'll just slowly make his way across the battlefield, not providing any like initial threat, but providing a large amount of time, large window of time where he can kind of play that defensive role and clog up the lane on defense for a little bit. Alrighty, now, if you're playing this deck in the challenge, I often open with the Goblin Giant just because they know that I have that card, so it's a little bit safer to play it, because then they, it won't be like a surprise or a giveaway to whatever deck you have. They know that you have Goblin Giant, so if you play it as your opening card, it's pretty safe. Alright guys, let's go ahead and talk about card replacements, and then we will call it a video. So the Goblin Giant. Now if you're going to replace the Goblin Giant, you would probably go with the regular Giant, and that's kind of the traditional version of this deck, and that's still a really solid deck. And if you want to try it out, I was thinking of doing a video on that deck, but I never got around to it, and I saw this one, decided I would try this out instead. And all these replays, as I don't know if I mentioned this, I should have earlier, all these replays are done from the challenge, from the Goblin Giant challenge. So I think that this deck would definitely work out in a regular challenge if you have that Goblin Giant. Just something to keep in mind, that's where these replays come from. Alrighty, so for the Princes, you want something else with like a charge effect. So my go-tos would be like a Bandit, but that's a legendary card, so it's not generally a great idea for a replacement. So maybe like the Battle Ram, you could play something kind of bridge spammy too, like a Royal Ghost or get fancy and go like Magic Archer or something. I've seen that in a lot of Bridge spam decks. That would give you some extra support. But I would go with like a charge unit, and if you don't have any of those, then maybe just like a knight or an ice golem, like kind of a mini tank. No, I don't know how I feel about that because you have the Goblin Giant in there. So let's go for more of a damaging card. Maybe even like a mini P.E.K.K.A. is a pretty solid replacement for a Prince, quite honestly. Alrighty, for the E-Wiz, my go-to replacement is always going to be a Musketeer just because it's a rare card and it costs the same amount of elixir and it plays a very similar role. And the fact that it's susceptible to Fireball, or Fireball and Zap will instantly kill it, and it's a ranged support unit that does a similar amount of damage. Alright, what's next? Well, we have the Mega Minion. So for Mega Minion, my go-to replacement is often minions. But something that you want to keep in mind is, for this card you want something that can hit air, probably, because when you're going for card replacements, that's something to keep in mind. Okay, I'm sacrificing an air hitting card. Now you have enough cards in this deck that do hit air that you might be okay without. You might be able to run like a mini P.E.K.K.A. or something like that. My go-to is usually minions. It doesn't provide like a super zap bait kind of element because they're not as susceptible to zap as like bats would be, and since you don't really have any other zap susceptible cards in this, bats might not be as good of a replacement because they would always be the card to get zapped every single time, right? So minions kind of play that role of being 3 elixir and having a good chunk of health, not being too weak, very similar to why I like archers. Now for log or zap, of course, you could always do arrows or maybe giant snowball. Get fancy. My go-to replacement for log is always zap, and for zap is always log. So, I mean, in that case, hey, I guess you're gonna switch it up and do like a barb barrel or snowball, or I guess arrows. Arrows is a common card, so that's a safe replacement. For poison, you could always go for a fireball, maybe even like a rocket or a lightning to get fancy and make this a bit of a heavier deck. But my go-to replacement for poison is pretty much always going to be fireball. It's a rare card, costs the same amount of elixir, and does a very similar amount of damage. Alright guys, that is it for this particular video on the Goblin Giant Double Prince deck. Hope that you guys enjoyed it. Make sure to leave a comment in the comment section below. I always love hearing what you guys have to say. Thank you so much for watching, guys, and have a good night.
Did something cool.